In this Python tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a URL shortener application using PyQt for a graphical user interface. You can do something like this: a really long URL, click shorten, and there you go. You've got a short URL to use. So in this tutorial, I'm going to help you build a really useful and practical tool for actual real life use. It's going to be a URL shortener built using Python, specifically using the PyQt GUI library. And this will allow users to input a long URL, generate a shorter version, copy it to a clipboard, or with a single click. And by the end of this tutorial, you'll have a sleek, modern app that combines functionality with a little bit of style. We'll add a bit of styling as well. But you'll have something that's got real-world usability. And it's a great thing to add to your portfolio to demonstrate to people in the real world that you can build things that are actually useful. So the goal of this project is to create a user-friendly GUI or a graphical user interface for shortening URLs. And this is what I'm going to cover. We're going to use PyQt to build the GUI. We're going to incorporate the PyShorteners library to generate short URLs. And we're going to customize the GUI with some style sheets to create a slightly more modern look. And of course, you can take this as far as you want to go. So before we get coding, we've got to make sure that we're all set up. Obviously, you must have Python installed, etc. 3.10 is what I'm using for this, but use whatever version is actually going to be working well with these libraries, but 3.10 is a good one to go with. And we need to install the required libraries using a basic command. So we head on over to our terminal and let's get these things set up. I already have them installed, but you would just run this command if you don't already have these libraries. So here I am at the terminal. And here are the libraries you need. You need PyQt, of course, for developing your GUI. This isn't come as standard with Python, so you have to install this. And also PyShorteners, which is going to handle our shortening of the URLs. So if you don't have these installed, make sure you install them on your own system. Once you're ready with that, you can then join me at your favorite Python editor, where we can start working on building this app. So here I am inside Visual Studio Code. I'm going to use this to create this project. I've got a brand new file called URL Shortener.py ready to go. And what I'm going to do is just get stuck straight in. The whole point of this project is to teach you to learn by coding. And rather than going in depth as well into how to use PyQt, because I've actually created an in-depth tutorial on how to use PyQt, so I'd recommend checking it out. It should be linked somewhere above, below. It will definitely be in the description, so check that out. If you've never used PyQt, but just creating any graphical user interfaces, I go into the basics of that. That is your kind of one-stop shop for understanding how it works. So when we are building this project, it won't be unfamiliar to you. It's fairly intuitive anyway, but if there's anything that doesn't make sense, rather than covering it here, it is covered in that video. So definitely check that out if you want to learn how to build GUIs with PyQt from scratch. And then you maybe want to come back to this one afterwards, whichever order makes sense to you. But I'm going to structure the application using OOP, Object-Oriented Programming. I think this approach is probably the neatest. It's going to organize related data and methods into a class, making the code reusable and easy to maintain. Let's start by doing our imports, and once we've done our imports, we'll then define the main class for our app and just create some kind of skeletal methods within our class. So in terms of imports, we need sys, and then we can import a bunch of widgets from PyQt. So I'm going to import the following. So you always need Qt application, you need Qt widget, of course, because that's what we're going to use to create our class, and then a bunch of widgets for actually creating our application. So a label, you're going to want text input, you're going to want some buttons and message boxes. Great. And we've got those, but then we need to obviously import the PyShorteners library too. This is going to be how we're going to shorten URLs. So let's make sure we import PyShorteners, and our imports are all taken care of. Let's get stuck in now and start defining our class. I'm going to call the class a URL Shortener App, and this is going to inherit from Qt widget. And of course, we need to start sketching out what's going on here. So we're inheriting from Qt widget because it's the base class for all windows in PyQt. I cover this in the PyQt detailed tutorial, so I'd go and check that out if this doesn't make sense to you. And then, of course, I now need to start sketching out the methods within the class. So we obviously have to begin with our magic method, our dunder, which is going to initialize a new instance of the class whenever we do a new object. Obviously passing in self. And we're going to be using super, did I do that properly? Super.great. Again, I cover that in the PyQt tutorial, so you can check that out if this doesn't make sense to you. But because we're inheriting, we need to make sure we're doing this to ensure that we are properly setting up the base class for our window. Because essentially our app, because it inherits from Qt widget, and this is our app is essentially an instance of a PyQt window. That's how this is working. That's why we're inheriting from Qt widget. And then we need to essentially define some methods. So let's define some methods. We're going to have a method called initUI, and this is going to be where we define all of our widgets that make up our app. And then we need a method to shorten the URL, always passing in self, obviously, to these methods within a class. I'm choosing pass at the moment because I'm just doing the skeleton for these. And then we're going to do a copy to clipboard method, which is how we're going to copy the URL to the clipboard. So it's ready to go for users that want to copy it from our app, which I think is a nice functionality to include. Okay, so we've defined 3 methods: init UI for setting the interface, shorten URL for shortening the URL, and copy to clipboard for copying the URL to the clipboard. So let's just start with the init UI method. And notice what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to make sure that I call that within here. And the reason I'm doing that is because we're encapsulating the creation of all our widgets in here. When we create a new window, we want to make sure that we create all those widgets at initialization, which is what we call it in the init method. Fairly logical. Okay, so we need to create our user interface inside the init UI method. And this interface is going to include a text input field for entering the long URL, a button to shorten URL. So you click this button and it's going to do the shortening process, a label to display the short URL, and a button to copy the shortened URL to your clipboard. So we've got a bunch of different things to do in this, of course, a bunch, but essentially I'm just going to rattle through them because what you should already know is that if you've done the PyQt tutorial or you're already familiar with it, this will all be fairly simple. These are simple widgets that I'm creating here. There's not much to explain. If any of it is confusing to you, again, I highly encourage you to check out my other tutorial on how to use PyQt. So let's begin. So self, obviously we are an instance for window, bear in mind it's inherited from QWidget. So let's just call the set window title. Bear in mind, I've got a new keyboard, sometimes my typing's not great, so bear with me. So URL shortener, should we add a capital L there? Great. Setting the title, and let's set the geometry as well. 100, 100, and 400, 250. Obviously, you can use whatever you want for this. I'm going to give it that for a fairly small box. And then we need to create a layout. So we're going to use our QV box layout. Great. And then let's go and create our label. And this is our instruction label. So we're going to say self.label is equal to QLabel. And then we're going to say the URL you want to shorten. Great. And then we need to obviously add this to our layout. So layout.add widget, and we're going to add label. Great. And we're going to repeat this same principle over and over again, excuse me, for each of these widgets that we're going to create here. So we need our input fields. We're going to allow users to enter their URL. So we need a URL input attribute, and use qline edit for that, of course. And then we're going to say URL input. We're going to set some placeholder text just so it tells users what they're supposed to do. Nice suggestive hint. And we'll say enter your here. Great. And then we're going to add that to our layout again. Great. Okay. So that is our input field handled. Now we need a button which they click on to shorten the URL. So let's call this the shorten button. So it's going to be a Q push button. Set the text to be shorten URL. Great. Back. Great. All right. Then we've got to connect this to a method. So we're using the clicked.connect method for this widget, and we're going to connect it to our shorten URL method here, which we haven't yet defined, but that's fine. We're going to get to that in a moment. So we can say once clicked, connect to self.shorten URL. Great. Okay. Again, this will be perfectly obvious to you if you've ever used PyQt or if you followed through my tutorial how that works. Then we're going to add this again to our layout button. Great. Now we need to create a label, which is going to be essentially where we show the shortened URL. So we're going to create another label. I'm going to call this short URL label. It's obviously going to be a Q label. And then we need to add this to our layout as well. And then this is going to be self.short URL label. Cool. Great. So now the last one is our copy button. This is how people are going to click on this. It's going to be wired up to our copy to clipboard method, and that's what will copy the shortened URL to clipboard for the user. So self copy button equal again to a Q push button. We'll set the text to this, which just says copy to clipboard. Great stuff. And then we're going to wire this up with click.connect. Self.copy button.click. Oh, not that. Click.connect. And we're going to wire this to the copy to clipboard function, which again is not yet defined, but we'll get around to that in a moment. So that's all good. We need to set this to false. We don't want this to be enabled right away. So we're going to set enabled to false because essentially we don't want to be able to copy this until it exists, right? If there's no short URL to copy, then this shouldn't be clickable. That makes a lot of sense to me. So self copy button, set enabled, and we're simply going to say false for now. And obviously we're going to enable this once we have a shortened URL for them to copy. We're going to add this to our layout again, self copy button. Excellent. And then finally, the last bit is we need to make sure that we set the layout for the window. Bearing in mind, like I said, because we're inherited from QWidget, the instance of the class is in fact the window. So we can just say self.set layout and then pass in layout. Great. And our init UI method is now defined. So when we create a new instance of the class, this will be called and all of these widgets will be created and associated with our window. Good. So if you use PyQt widgets like the label, QLine edit, and QPush button to create the interface, they're all organized vertically using the QVBox layout. Now, I think the next thing to do is that we can actually add some styling. So we'll do this just while we're here. We'll add some styling. And then once the styling is added, these will all be applied to the widgets that's within there. And then once we've got the styling taken care of, we can add our functionality. So we'll just quickly rattle through the styling just to make it nice and easy. So adding the styling. So we can add it in the init UI. I think it makes sense to do it there. So we can say self.set, and then within this, we're going to create a multi-line string. And this is essentially like CSS. So if you've seen my other tutorial, you've seen me do some styling in that. And this looks a lot like CSS. So if you've ever done any web development and it's involved in the CSS, this should be really intuitive for you. So QWidget, of course, is the window. So we're going to set the parameters for the window, and we would just say background. So rather than speaking these out loud, I'm just going to quickly rattle through them all, because in essence, if you understand web styling, or if you've done my other tutorial, this should all be really obvious to you. And really, CSS, when you read it, it kind of feels like English anyway, doesn't it? Once you get the hang of CSS and any form of styling language, you notice that it does read a lot like English. So let's say the color for this, I'll go with 003366. Oh, I must make sure that I use my semicolons. And then we'll say the font size, 14 pixels. Say the font weight is bold. Great. Okay, that's the label. Then let's do our text input. Okay, and for this, we'll just say give it border, 2 pixels, solid. Then give it a radius and some curvature. Pixels, and then we'll add some padding, maybe 8 pixels, not that. And then we'll set the font size as well, and we'll say 14 pixels. Consistent, great. So that all looks fine. Just double checking there's no obvious errors in that. All looks good. And then we'll do the push button, and we'll add a hover effect to the push button, and then we'll be done. Great. So push button, and we're going to say we're going to give it background color. We'll go with this, a white border radius. So probably copied this, but I'm typing it now, so we'll just carry on. Why not? Padding, and then font size, 15 pixels as well, and font weight, bold. Great. And then we're going to add a hover effect. So just like you would in CSS with the colon and then the hover. And then I'll just say, once we do hover, let's change the background color, and let's make this. Okay, I'm just going to quickly read over this, make sure there's no obvious errors in that. So everything, all the labels are correct. There's no spelling errors. We've got semicolons after all of our styling definitions. If anything doesn't work, that's probably going to slip by me, but I think that looks good. Great. So this style sheet hopefully will give the app a slightly more polished look, blue tones around the buttons, and a clean layout. Of course, you could make whatever changes you want to this. You can go as far and as deep as you like, especially when you get into the kind of UX, UI element of building apps. This is something that you could really go down deep. This is a rabbit hole. But for now, this is going to look nice for this app. Great. All right. So we've set our style sheet. Now let's add some functionality. Now bear in mind, we've got two methods here that we need to do something with: shorten URL and copy to clipboard. Okay, so let's start by implementing the shorten URL method to generate short URLs using the PyShorteners library. And here's how it's going to work. We're going to create a shorten object in the PyShorteners library. We're going to call the .tinyurl.short method. Then we're going to pass in a long URL to this to then generate a shortened version. The short URL is going to be assigned to a Q label widget, which means is why it's going to be shown within our app. And we'll style this as a clickable hyperlink using the set open external links method, which we'll see when we code it. And then finally, we'll then go to the copy to clipboard button and enable this to allow the user to copy the shortened URL. Remember, we set this enabled as false. We need to enable it to true once we've got a shortened URL. So let's just dive into this right now. Okay, so what do we need to begin with? We need to get the long URL, and we're going to fetch that from the text input. So we're saying long URL is equal to self URL input. We want to use the text getter method to fetch it, and we're going to use the built-in Python string strip method to strip any leading and trailing white space. We've got a nice, neat URL. So obviously, if this is blank, this would evaluate to false. So we could essentially do a check to ensure there is a URL to use. And if there isn't one, we could return and just give a message box with the warnings. Let's say if not long URL. Now, what does this work? Obviously, if long URL is false because it's blank, not false is true. Therefore, we go into this and we could just say, if not, let's create a queue message box. We're going to make this a warning box. And obviously, we need to associate this with ourselves because we're the window. Give it a title of input error. And then we'll give a message which just says, hey, please enter a URL to shorten. Great. Now, of course, if the user has entered a URL, this will fail, and we won't go into that. We won't enter this at all. But if they haven't, we do this. And of course, I also need to make sure that we return. So we're returning because the user hasn't done what they're supposed to do. Excellent. So assuming that they have, now we need to do something with the URL. I'm going to use a try except block because obviously it makes sense to have some graceful error handling. So I'll say try, and then let's say accept exception as E, and would create a queue message box, make this critical box, obviously assigned again to self because we're the window, title of error, and then would put an F string there and just say fail to shorten URL, and then let's show the error using the string method, pass in E, which we passed in there. Great. I've done the accept bit right away just to get that out of the way. I think it makes sense just to handle that, then we can focus on our try block. But essentially, if something goes wrong, we're creating a critical message box, labeling error, and then passing a string version of the error into the body to let the user know what went wrong. Now, of course, depending on how professional this app was, you might want to conceal that from users or have more advanced error handling to handle particular types of error and do different things based upon those errors. But for right now, this is a nice starting point. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to create a shortener object in here. So we're using the PyShorteners library. So let's create a shortener and we're going to label that variable shortener, and we're going to say PyShorteners shortener. Excellent. So that is our shortener object created. Great. Now we need to essentially create a short URL from our long URL. So now we've got the long URL here. Let's do something with that. Let's create a short URL variable, and we're going to get this by saying shortener.tiny URL, and then within that we're going to pass in long URL. Okay, so what we're saying is we've got our shortener object from PyShorteners.shortener. We are using the tiny URL.short method, and with that we are saying pass in the long URL as our argument and return that to short URL. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully that seems fairly logical, and that makes a fair amount of sense when you read that. Now, once we've got the short URL, we need to assign it to a label to show it to the user, right? We need to show it within our app window. So let's create something with that. So we've got our short URL label already created. Remember, if we come back up here, we have our short URL label already created. And it's an attribute for ourself. So we could just say, great, okay, self.short URL label. I'm going to say set text using the set text method as a setter. And I'm going to pass in an F string. I'm going to say short URL, and then I am going to put this within an anchor tag so it displays as a clickable link. Okay, so how am I going to do that? Okay, I've got short URL. I need to create my anchor tag. So I'm going to say atra. So if you've done any HTML before, this should be fairly obvious to you. And then we need to pass in, of course, the short URL as the actual destination. And then what we could do after that is that we could set the style, and we could say color, and it pass in, say 007B, and of course need to terminate that with a semicolon. Great, so we've got that, and then we need to make sure we've got so we've got style, color, we need to make sure we terminate that with a quote, closing caret, then within that short URL, and then obviously we need to have our closing anchor tag. Great, so you should be able to read that as an anchor tag in HTML. we have used the URL as the destination. We've added a tiny bit of styling. We've obviously used the URL as the text for the anchor tag as well. So it'll show the full short URL. You could put whatever you want in there if you wanted. You could just literally write short URL. But I think, that's really down to your own preference. Excellent. So we've created that. We've set the text in our label. Now, the last thing to do is we need to make sure that we are setting open external links to true, and then setting the button to copy it enabled to true as well. Okay. So we've created a hyperlink, but we need to make sure that it's set to open external links. So we just say self.short URL label, and we say set open external links, and we're going to pass in true. Great. And then finally, we want to make sure the copy button is now enabled as well. So we want users to be able to copy this URL. Okay. So what we're saying is that we've tried everything in here. If everything passes at the end, we're setting copy true. If anything fails, of course, we've got our error handling. But that is our shorten URL method taken care of. Everything is now implemented in there. So the last bit is to implement our copy to clipboard method to enable the user to copy the short URL. So let's jump in there now. And what we're going to do is we're going to retrieve the shorten URL from the Q label. We're going to strip any unnecessary text. Obviously, there shouldn't be any, but we're going to strip it. Then we're going to use the Q application's clipboard method to copy the URL to the system clipboard. And then we're just going to show a message box to confirm that the URL has been successfully copied. So when you copy something, you usually get some kind of confirmation. So we're going to use a message box to do that for the user. So let's go into this method now. Let's just scroll down a bit, give ourselves a bit more space. So we've got short URL as our first variable. And where are we getting this from? Obviously from our short URL label. That's where it is. Using the text getter to fetch that, we'll use the following. We need to strip away, of course, all of the stuff we had at the start, this short URL bit. We need to strip that off. So let's make sure that we use a replace string method from Python and say strip short URL. Okay, and we're going to replace that with, of course, a blank string. And then we're going to use a strip method call as well, just to ensure there's no more leading or trailing white space in our string. So what we should have left is just an 8s, and it's a clickable link. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward Python string manipulation. So assuming everything's worked, we will have a string. Of course, if we don't, we won't do anything, but if we do, we will do something. And we do that with a really easy if block. We could say, if the short URL is a string, do something. If not, we'll do nothing whatsoever. And essentially this method will become redundant. So we could say Q application, and we're going to say clipboard, and then we're going to say, I want to set the text of the clipboard, and I'm going to pass in the short URL, which we have just cleaned up over here. So we've cleaned it all up, and we're now setting it to the system clipboard with that. Great. So that has now copied the text to the clipboard. Now, the last bit is to basically show a message box, a pop-up box, let the user know, hey, it's all copied, everything's great. We use a Q message box. We're going to make this an information box. And obviously we're going to assign this to ourselves as the window, and we're going to make the title copied, and then the text inside that's just going to say short URL copied to clipboard. Excuse my typing, it's absolutely dreadful at the moment. Okay, copied to clipboard. Great, that all looks good. So we've retrieved the short URL from the label, stripped the necessary text. We've used the Q application's clipboard method, copied the URL to the system clipboard, and we've displayed a message box. We can now save that, and we are now nearly done. The last bit is to basically initialize and run the application. We've done everything else we need to do. Everything here is all nicely tied together. The last bit is to basically run our app. So how are we going to do that? Pretty easy. We're going to create an if name equals main block. And then what do we need to do? We need to create an app. I'm going to pass in RB. Now, if this doesn't make sense to you, I'd recommend just checking out my tutorial on how to use PyQt. But basically, every application needs to have a Q application. That's how it works. And then from that point on, we need to create a window. And this window is, of course, going to be a URL Shortener App instance, because that's what we've just done. We've just defined a class and it inherits from Q widget, which is how we create the window. Awesome. Now we can say window.show. That will show our app. And then we use this to execute everything and close up properly. Great. And then we can simply hit save. And this block will create the application, display the main window, and start the event loop. So let's run the code and see what we get. And hopefully everything is going to work the way we would want it to work. So give me a moment and let's see what we can get from this. Okay, so let's run our application. Hit enter. You can ignore that because that is just related to my GPU. And here we go. We now have our enter the URL and shorten, enter the URL here, click shorten, and copy to clipboard. Notice that this doesn't hover because it's currently disabled. I click shorten without anything entered. What do we get? Please enter a URL. Okay, so I need to enter a URL to shorten. So what should I enter? How about I enter a long URL like this? So imagine you head on over to hack.io and you want to, in essence, create professional portfolio projects. Why wouldn't you? This is one of those things. It's a great choice. But the URL is quite long and you want to share it with a friend. That's okay. So what you could do is you could use our URL shortening app. I will enter that URL here. I will click shorten URL. And here is our short URL. It is clickable, as you can see, or I could copy it to the clipboard. So if I copy it to the clipboard, it says it's being copied. I should then be able to head back over to our tab here. I can click it in here. And there you go. It is showing like that. So now we are able to copy our URL. Of course, we could just click it on here if we wanted to, or we could copy it and it's got a styled link that we could drop anywhere that we wanted to. So that's lovely. So we've got our link, which is usable, or we've got a clickable link inside the app here. And everything is working as you'd expect. So what I would like to do is I'd like to be able to click on this link and navigate to the URL. I've clicked on that and here we go. I am now inside the page and everything is working as you'd expect it to. So it's all great. Everything is working just the way that we wanted it. Beautiful. There we go. Great work. You've now built a fully functional URL shortener with a modern PyQt interface. And hopefully you can see this product demonstrates how Python can be used to create really user-friendly applications with decent styling. So you can take the styling far further if you so wanted to. I try enhancing the application by adding features like validating URLs, maybe even supporting multiple shortening services. So you can take this wherever you want it to go. But in essence, this is opening up your horizons to be able to use Python to create desktop apps, also to create real-world apps, the real-world utility. This is a real-world functional app you can actually use, and you can tweak it however you like. So if there's anything in this video that didn't make sense, or there's something you'd like me to cover in more detail in a future video, by all means, feel free to drop a comment. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you in the next one.